Good afternoon. My name is Catherine Nadeau, and I'm the Water and Natural Resources Program Director for Environmental Advocates of New York. I'd like to thank the senators for convening this hearing and for inviting me to testify today. Environmental Advocates' mission is to protect our air, land, water, and the health of all New Yorkers. We monitor state government, evaluate proposed laws, and champion policies and practices that will ensure the responsible stewardship of our shared environment and to make New York a leader. So, as we sit here discussing fracking today, I just want to point out that some of my testimony has been covered by previous speakers, so I'll kind of jump around a little bit to not beat on issues that have already been discussed.
Yeah, we have most of the testimony that's submitted in writing. So yeah, if you could paraphrase,
Great.
it'd be okay.
Great, thank you. So fracking, as we've discussed at length this afternoon, is a process that, if allowed to proceed as proposed currently by New York State officials, it would industrialize much of upstate New York and undoubtedly lead to accident spills and air and water contamination. Just last week, the Environmental Protection Agency released preliminary studies pointing to water contamination caused by fracking. This was discussed earlier. I only bring it up now just because this is an issue where the industry has said over and over and over again that fracking doesn't contaminate water supplies. It's not contaminating groundwater. Whether or not the exact scenarios hold true in every state across the nation, this is an issue that calls those claims into question for sure. So as we discuss this, we need to keep in mind the sources of the information and where this is all coming from. So New Yorkers know that contamination can happen, and we understand that fracking cannot happen at the scale and the pace projected by the Department of Environmental Conservation, which, as said, is up to including 1,600 wells drilled per year, without serious consequences, especially to our waters. So far, DEC has issued 3 drafts of the Supplemental Generic Environmental Impact Statement for public review, 2 for public comment, and despite improvements in the process as it's gone along, much more analysis on waste production, transport, and treatment remains, and additional mitigation measures need to be evaluated if any fracking is going to be permitted in New York State. And New Yorkers are rightfully concerned that improperly treated waste will pollute the state's waters. And based on reports from Pennsylvania and other states in the nation, these concerns are well-founded. So my testimony really focuses on how fracking waste is classified in New York and making sure that if it is in fact hazardous, it's classified as hazardous, making sure that we're prohibiting fracking waste treatment at the state's publicly owned treatment works, and DEC resources. These are not environmental advocates' only concerns as related to fracking, but just given the scope of the hearing today, this is where I'm focusing my testimony. So the first part of my testimony relates to how much fracking waste may be produced, and I think NRDC covered this fairly well, but I will just say that this is a tremendous amount of wastewater, anywhere on the order of billions of gallons per year, hundreds of billions gallons over the projected 30-year life of the play in the modeling that DEC has done so far. And right now we are in a tricky situation because these wastes are not considered hazardous, even if in fact they are, and we are allowing them to be, or we may, under the DEC's proposals, allow them to be treated at facilities that are ill-equipped to do so. Now first, under state regulations, drilling waste is just by definition not hazardous waste. As Mr. Leff said from the Department of Environmental Conservation, it is treated as industrial waste. He's claimed that this is because the federal government doesn't classify the waste as hazardous waste either, and that therefore New York State has tied our regulations to the feds. This is a case where the DEC can and should go far beyond what the federal government is doing. And this happens all across our regulations and in our laws now. If you look at the Clean Air Act, if you look at the Clean Water Act, these are both delegated programs in New York State where it's the state's responsibility to carry these out. And in both cases, we have standards and requirements that go beyond what the federal government has provided for. And this is because upon careful examination, the state has realized that if we're going to protect our resources, we need to set in place the most stringent standards possible. So this is something that the state, there's plenty of precedent for it, and the state should do it in this case as well. So because they're not, and I want to get at what does this really mean because they're not classified as hazardous waste. First of all, when it comes to transportation, they're not required to have the same level of manifest systems. And when it comes down to disposal, they're not required to be treated at facilities specifically constructed and designed to handle the toxicity of these wastes. Just for an example, I went through the the revised draft supplemental generic environmental impact statement and went through the state's hazardous waste regulations, just like I'm sure a lot of other people in this room have done. And to look at, if this waste coming off the wells is in fact hazardous and why. And one of the contaminants, one of the toxins that is listed in state regulations, hazardous waste regulations, is barium. And it's concluded that barium at levels of 100 milligrams per liter or more would be considered hazardous by definition under state regulation. Then I went to the state's draft plans and went to industry studies themselves and said, okay, so if this is the case, do we have any studies that prove that we've got levels of barium in the waste that would trigger the standard? And we do. According to an industry study of 8 Marcellus shale wells identified in the northern counties of Pennsylvania with comparable character to the New York Play area. The level of barium detected in flowback fluid ranged, but on day one of the flowback, the first day that the water was coming out of the well, the median level there was 387 milligrams per liter, so clearly above the 100 milligrams per liter standard in state regulations. And then on day 14 and 15, the amount of barium detected in flowback fluid varied as well, but again, the median level was 1,835 milligrams per liter, far exceeding the state's standards for hazardous waste. So if this were created by any other industry, General Motors, General Electric, anybody else in the state, this would be considered hazardous waste. But because by definition it is not. The state looked at tests coming from Pennsylvania and West Virginia, and again, there were varying levels of barium detected, but the median level detected there was 1,450 milligrams per liter. So this is, a lot of these wastes clearly would fall under the category of hazardous. Another problem with the fact that this definition rules them out of treatment as hazardous waste is that we're not only talking about what might come down the road with high-volume hydraulic fracturing. Under current drilling in New York State, under the current hazardous waste loophole, these exemptions, that means that we're not looking at what's happening with the waste being created now either. Getting back to the transport for a minute here. The DEC, as has been discussed at length, has proposed a tracking system for fracking waste. They keep saying it's similar to the medical waste system, and that is indeed the case. And this is a great example of good public relations because everybody hears medical waste and goes, because it sounds gross. But this doesn't live up to the standards of what would be required under hazardous waste regulations. And in one particular point specifically, for the medical waste tracking system, the medical waste generators, transporters, and handlers all have to report, all have to keep the manifest systems, but they have to, the manifest tracking forms, but they have to, those entities keep the forms on site and are available at the request of the Department of Environmental Conservation. Under hazardous waste regulations, those have to be reported to the state. They're put into a database, and that way anybody, you, me, anybody in the public can go and look and see what is in fact happening with this waste. This is a big problem, especially with DEC staffing and resources being what they are at historically low levels. This means that we've got a very important check in the system, in the proposed system, which would be missing if the state goes forward not counting this as hazardous waste. Now, that's just on the transport. That's to say nothing of what actually happens to the waste once it arrives at the facilities and how it's treated, how it would be treated there. Moving on a bit to the other issue identified today is treating waste at the publicly owned treatment works, the municipal sewage systems. A big problem with treating fracking waste at these plants is the levels of total dissolved solids in fracking waste. Total dissolved solids are essentially salts, they're metals, and they are found in fracking waste at levels 1.2 0.6 to 6.6 times the levels found in seawaters. This is incredibly, incredibly salty waters. Excuse me. Sewage plants aren't designed to remove these types of salts. They salts and in fact, according to the Supplemental Generic Environmental Impact Statement, salts and dissolved solids may not be sufficiently treated at municipal treatment and or treatment technologies not designed to remove pollutants of this nature. So that means if these wastes are disposed and sent to these types of plants, the best that we could hope for is that they would be diluted, that the waste would go in and that they would pass through the system diluted. This leads to lots of other problems when you get into cumulative impacts. If you've got more than one plant treating fracking waste on the same water body, now you run into problems like what was seen in Pennsylvania, where all of these wastes add up because they don't disappear once they go into the ecosystem. In fact, they just keep getting worse. The DEC went on in the Supplemental Generic Environmental Impact Statement to further question whether or not this should be treated at our municipal treatment plants. And I quote, "There's questionable available capacity for POTWs in New York State to accept high-volume hydraulic fracturing wastewater. Further, because of the inability of biological treatment systems to remove certain high-volume hydraulic fracturing additives in flowback water, as previously described, POTWs are not usually equipped to accept influent containing these contaminants. The potential for inhibition of biological activity and sludge settling and the potential for radionuclide concentration in the sludge impacts sludge disposal options." So if we take this apart, the state is questioning the capacity, how much, which basically means two things. First, can the plant handle it? Is there literally capacity? Is there room in the pipes? Secondly, it also gets at the ability for the receiving water, the capacity of the receiving water to handle this type of waste and to take that on. The state then went on to say because of the inability of biological treatment systems to remove certain additives, again, the TDS being one of these, they're not usually equipped to accept the influent. They're not usually equipped to accept these wastes. And then third, the potential for inhibition of biological activity. And this is something that the gentleman from Niagara Falls had touched upon. We've got most of our treatment plants in New York State relying on biological systems, meaning that these are bacteria that break down the waste. These are bugs, and they rely on having certain water quality standards within those systems in order to properly break down municipal sewage. If we start allowing very, very salty waste to enter this system without being properly treated, if this goes in, we run the risk of essentially shutting down the plant, making the plant itself unable to treat other wastes. And because fracking waste would presumably be just one portion of waste that any of these plants are accepting if this is allowed to go forward, then we run the risk of the plant not being able to treat the waste it was designed to treat and that communities rely on for treatment. In Pennsylvania, they ran into all sorts of problems. The industry admitted as much in a Post-Gazette article where they said that the natural gas industry is a contributing factor to elevated levels of contaminants in various rivers. So based on the state's concerns regarding the questionable available capacity, the potential of inhibition of biological activity and sludge settling, and Pennsylvania's experience and citizen opposition to the practice, municipal treatment plants in New York State should not be permitted to accept fracking waste. In my testimony, I go on to just touch on the issue of recycling and reuse. I would just like to echo what I said before. This is promising. The more that can be recycled and reused, the better. If this industry is going to operate, we want to make sure that they are using as little fresh water as possible and polluting as little water as possible. However, at the end of the day, you still have contaminants that need to be dealt with. So in the coming session, there are a couple of things that the Senate can work to do. First, passing Senate Bill 4616, as had been said before, and we appreciate the senator's support for this. This is a bill that's given 3 trees an environmental advocates rating system. It's been designated a super bill by the environmental community, showing the community's strong support for this measure. And it's a very basic and a very reasonable action to ask these companies to take, that if the waste would be classified as hazardous waste to treat it as such. Secondly, the Senate can act to make sure that municipal treatment plants are not accepting fracking waste. Third, the New York State Comptroller is advancing legislation to establish strict liability as well as a spill cleanup fund. This gets at the problem of what happens if something goes wrong, what happens if a company does not act as a good actor in New York and then moves on. It gives New York an ability to go back and make sure that there is a fund in place to provide for any cleanup that happens. Assemblyman Sweeney is carrying this bill, and it's something that the Senate should consider as well. And then finally, on the issue of DEC funding and staffing, as the senators are both well aware, this is an issue that funding and staffing issues are plaguing the DEC from top to bottom and in every division within the agency. They're operating with fewer staff than they were in the 1980s, yet the responsibilities of the agency to protect our water, our communities, has only increased. We are at a very critical time right now as everybody's looking towards the next session and looking towards the budget. As a member of the Fracking Advisory Panel, the Environmental Advocates is looking at this issue closely and participating in discussions with other stakeholders about how this should move forward. But what has become clear is that industry should not be externalizing the costs of oversight and of running a system that is essentially designed to cater this one industry's needs. This is something that industry needs to take a strong lead on as well. So that is, in a nutshell, my testimony. I appreciate your time. I appreciate your leadership on this, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Yeah, we're gonna ask you some questions. We got to take a break for a few minutes. They have to change some of the technical and audio, so we're gonna take like a 5-minute break. No, we gotta do it now. You can wait 5 minutes, right?
I can.
Okay. Then you gotta change your tape. I gotta run out. Okay.
Everybody stretch.
Yeah. So everybody take 5, I guess. Yeah, it's half time for you. This is